Frank Sinatra, a man who could silence a room with just a single note, a name that defined an entire era of music. To the world, he was Old Blue Eyes, the charming crooner every man wanted to be and every woman wanted to love. But behind the lights, the adoration, and the fame, his life was far darker than anyone could imagine. From near death at birth to secret ties with the mob, brutal feuds, and a kidnapping that shocked the nation, Sinatra's real story isn't the glamorous fairy tale the world remembers. It's a story of survival, power, and controversy that shadowed him until his final days. And it all began the moment he entered this world, barely alive. On December 12, 1915, in a cramped New Jersey apartment kitchen, a baby was brought into the world weighing a massive 13.5 pounds. But something was horribly wrong. The infant, Francis Albert Sinatra, was silent, blue, and not breathing. The doctor, convinced he was stillborn, turned his focus to saving the mother, but the baby's grandmother refused to give up. In a desperate attempt to spark life, she ran the tiny body under freezing water, slapped his back, and prayed. Miraculously, a cry pierced the air. Frank Sinatra had cheated death before he'd even taken his first breath. That brutal delivery would leave its mark forever. The forceps used to pull him out tore his face, neck, and jawline, scarring him for life. Kids would later mock him as Scarface, and even at the height of fame, Sinatra used thick makeup to hide the reminder of how close he came to never existing. But this was just the first sign that Sinatra's life would never follow an ordinary path. Growing up, Sinatra's life looked picture-perfect from the outside, a loving Italian family in the bustling streets of Hoboken, New Jersey. But behind closed doors, little Frank spent most of his childhood alone. He was the only child in a neighborhood where families often had half a dozen kids crammed into a single apartment. To other children, it felt strange. To Frank, it felt isolating. His father, Marty, split his time between running a bar and prize fighting. His mother, Dolly, was constantly busy with politics and helping desperate women in secret as a midwife. That left Frank in the care of his grandmother or wandering the streets on his own. In an interview years later, he confessed what it felt like. "I used to wish I had an older brother to help me when I needed him. I wished I had a younger sister I could protect. That yearning for connection, for someone to notice him, may have planted the seed for what would define his life, the desperate hunger to be seen, adored, and never left alone again. But getting the world's attention wouldn't come easily, and the path to fame would test him in ways no child could have imagined. Sinatra knew one thing early on: music was his escape. The voice that would one day make millions swoon first echoed in tiny Hoboken bars and school hallways. But his dream of turning that voice into a career? His parents weren't convinced. Marty, his father, saw singing as a hobby at best. He wanted Frank to go to school, get a real job, maybe at the Stevens Institute of Technology, something safe and stable. But stability was the last thing Frank wanted. He craved the stage lights, the roar of applause, the love he never felt as a lonely kid. It wasn't until his mother saw the fire in his eyes and realized just how much talent he had that things started to change. Dolly became his quiet powerhouse, pulling strings only she could pull. She bought him sheet music when money was tight, sound equipment when he needed it, and even used her political connections to sneak him onto local stages. Her help landed him a spot with the Hoboken Four, a local singing group. It wasn't glamorous, they were mostly performing for pocket change and cheap applause, but for Sinatra, it was oxygen. When the group dissolved, he waited tables to get by, never once letting go of the dream. Then everything changed. A gig with trumpet player Harry James put him in the right spotlight at the right time. By 1940, band leader Tommy Dorsey saw something nobody else had yet dared to believe. Sinatra wasn't just a good singer, he was destined to own the stage. But success wouldn't bring peace, because once Frank started climbing, powerful enemies started watching, and the first came from a man he once idolized. Long before Sinatra was a household name, there was another king of the crooners, Bing Crosby. Young Frank worshipped him, plastering his idol's photo on his bedroom wall, dreaming of one day singing like him. But fame is fickle. By the 1940s, Sinatra wasn't just following Crosby's footsteps, he was stepping on his heels. Teenage girls screamed his name, fainted at his shows, tore at his clothes. Even Crosby had to admit, half-jokingly, "He's a singer that comes along once in a lifetime, but why did it have to be my lifetime?" The press turned this into a rivalry, and while it started lighthearted, Sinatra secretly hated being compared to anyone. Behind his charm was a deep, gnawing fear that his fame could vanish as quickly as it came, and it nearly did. Twice. In the early 50s, a fresh young talent named Eddie Fisher stole the spotlight, sending Sinatra into a spiral of doubt, convinced his career was over. Then came Jimmy Roselli, another Italian-American kid from Sinatra's own Hoboken neighborhood, with a voice even some insiders whispered might be better than Frank's. Worse, Roselli was adored by Sinatra's closest friends, even his own mother. Frank didn't forgive betrayal easily. When Roselli refused to perform at a charity event for free, Sinatra allegedly used his powerful connections to blacklist him, crushing his career before it could take off. That was Frank's world. You were either with him or erased. And behind the velvet voice, people were starting to realize this man didn't just know the music business, he knew power. And the darker truth, that power didn't come from Hollywood. It came from people you really didn't want to cross. Frank Sinatra wasn't just rubbing elbows with Hollywood's elite, he was breaking bread with some of the most feared men in America. For decades, whispers followed him everywhere. Quiet meetings with Chicago's Sam Giancana, late-night parties with the Fischetti brothers, casual dinners with Detroit's Giacalone mobsters. Wherever there was power, money, and influence, Sinatra was at the table. Officially, he denied everything. But the FBI wasn't buying it. They kept a thick file on him for years, documenting his every move. Agents claimed Sinatra had a direct line to mob bosses, and insiders swore that if someone crossed him, a club owner, a promoter, even another artist, it was only a matter of time before a pair of tough guys paid them a visit. And somehow, Sinatra always came out on top. Contracts that bound him mysteriously vanished. Rivals found their careers stalled. Anyone who insulted him publicly learned the hard way that Sinatra had friends in places you didn't want enemies. In return, he owed favors. Late-night shows for businessmen, private performances in backrooms thick with cigar smoke and cash. And while Sinatra never faced charges, his entire career danced on a razor's edge between music royalty and mafia royalty. It gave him power beyond the stage, but it also built a shadowy reputation. Because now, Frank Sinatra wasn't just the golden boy of American music, he was a man you didn't dare say no to. And when that temper of his exploded, the world saw just how dangerous it could be. Frank Sinatra was smooth on stage, but offstage, his charm could turn to fury in an instant. Those closest to him knew there were two Franks, the gentleman who could melt hearts with a song, and the man with a volcanic temper that no one wanted to ignite. One missed spotlight during a show in Hong Kong sent him into a rampage, smashing antiques and destroying his entire dressing room. Another night, drunk and enraged, he drove a golf cart straight through a shopping mall window. It wasn't just furniture that suffered his wrath, people did too. Comedians were among his favorite targets. Shecky Greene once made a remark Frank didn't like. Soon after, he was jumped by Sinatra's friends. Jackie Mason made jokes about Sinatra marrying 21-year-old Mia Farrow. A few days later, shots were fired into his hotel room. Mason survived, but not without a broken nose and shattered cheekbones. The message was clear: mock Sinatra, and you paid the price. Behind the glamour, Sinatra wasn't just feared for his mob connections. He was feared because of his own unpredictable rage. People walked on eggshells around him, knowing that one wrong word could spark an explosion. But even that fear couldn't protect the person Frank loved most, because soon, tragedy would strike his own family in a way no one saw coming. By the early 60s, Frank Sinatra had conquered the world. Fame, fortune, power, he had it all. But in December 1963, his glamorous empire collided with a nightmare no parent ever wants to face. His 19-year-old son, Frank Sinatra Jr., was following in his father's footsteps, performing a small show at Harrah's Club Lodge in Lake Tahoe. The night seemed ordinary, until a knock at the dressing room door changed everything. A man claimed to be delivering a package. When the door opened, two strangers stormed in, tied up Sinatra Jr.'s friend, and dragged the young singer out at gunpoint. Hours later, Frank Sr. received the unthinkable, a ransom demand for $240,000. The FBI was immediately involved, but every moment felt like a countdown. Even Sinatra, arguably one of the most powerful men in entertainment, was helpless. The money was paid, the agents tracked every lead, but for days, no one knew if his son was alive. Finally, after a tense standoff among the kidnappers themselves, Sinatra Jr. was released, wandering alone in Bel Air, shaken but alive. Soon after, 3 men were arrested, the ransom recovered, and the case closed. But rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the whole thing was staged for publicity, a desperate move to launch Frank Jr.'s career. The FBI evidence told a different story, proving the abduction was real. Still, the whispers never fully died, adding yet another layer of darkness and mystery to the Sinatra legacy. For all his power, connections, and fearsome reputation, even Frank Sinatra couldn't shield his own family from danger. And in the years that followed, as age caught up to him, the man who once seemed untouchable began to fade away. Frank Sinatra lived his life like a song, loud, unforgettable, impossible to ignore. But even legends can't outrun time. By the 1990s, the man who once commanded stages around the world was struggling just to stay alive. Years of hard living caught up to him: heart problems, high blood pressure, pneumonia, bladder cancer, and then came the cruelest blow: dementia, slowly stealing the sharp mind that had outmaneuvered rivals, mobsters, and presidents alike. On May 14, 1998, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, Old Blue Eyes sang his final note. Surrounded by his wife Barbara and his 3 children, he whispered 2 haunting last words: "I'm losing." Moments later, the man who had once felt untouchable was gone, age 82. Even in death, Sinatra remained larger than life. He was buried with a pack of Camel cigarettes, a bottle of Jack Daniels, a Zippo lighter, and $1 worth of dimes, a nod to the payphones he once used to call home while on the road. As Bono of U2 later said, Frank Sinatra was the 20th century. He was modern, complex, had swing and attitude. He was the boss, but he was always Frank Sinatra. We won't see his like again. Behind the glamour and the gold records, his life was never just music. It was survival, scandal, and a battle to stay on top. A story the world thought it knew, but never truly did. Frank Sinatra's life wasn't the perfect fairy tale the world imagined. It was a life clawed from tragedy, fueled by power plays, mob whispers, and battles no microphone could silence. He wasn't just a singer, he was a survivor, a fighter, and sometimes a feared man in a velvet suit. But for all the glamour and chaos, one truth remains. Sinatra built an empire on a voice that could break hearts, while hiding scars the world would never fully see. And he wasn't the only icon with a story like this. Because behind the spotlight, many of music's biggest legends were hiding secrets darker than their brightest songs.